All right, welcome everybody to the July 11th community meeting for 2023. Today we have a pretty small agenda. We are going to be talking about adding the COP roles to the AWX collection. We're going to be talking about some job lifecycle that Seth Foster did. And then I'm going to make a quick announcement about the developer series. And we have one more quick announcement that's going to come from Jake at the very end. And then the remaining time is open for discussion. So with that, I will kick it off to anybody that wants to talk about the AWX collection. And if you need to, feel free to take over the screen share.
I guess I can start it. So I think the controller config roles are extremely popular, and I think there's a large demand for it. And I think the most natural thing to do would be to include it into the actual AWX collection. It's the most popular way of maintaining AWX configuration with code, and it is and it will just help if we put it into the collection or with the modules and everything. It will be easier to maintain and update when a new feature gets added to a module, to then add it to the role at the same time, and just keep them in sync, as well as then it's just one collection to simplify the release, and then tracking purposes, what version the collection will work on for AWX will match, obviously, the version of AWX that's running. And yeah, I don't know. That's kind of my short. I don't know, Sean, if you want to go more into it.
Actually, I had a quick question. I had a slight glitch with my audio. Did we describe what this collection is in relation to the AWX collection, or what these roles are, just for anybody who's not familiar with them?
So I'll go into that. Is the roles that we're proposing on adding is the wrappers on the modules with async. That basically the wrappers themselves are basically a way to loop around the module options. So that way, customer just needs to provide the data in order to basically, you want to upload, 60 projects and 70 inventory sources. You just got to provide the data to input into it, and it pushes up to the collection using the modules. So they are complementary collections. And what we basically proposed here is basically adding only the complementary roles to modules, the roles that basically correspond to the modules. We have other things and a few other options in the collection that are more opinionated on things. But we basically were looking at the wrapper roles basically specifically added to the collection.
Yeah, we have a couple custom plugins and stuff like that that have been written that we did not include because we figured that it would be more challenging to maintain, and so we left those out. And like Sean was saying, there's a couple roles that are very opinionated way of going about configuration, which we also excluded because those are also, because they're very opinionated, they're also very easy to break. And so they're a lot more effort to maintain, and so we excluded those.
So would those still be maintained inside a COP
those would
collection?
Stay where they're at. We would
stay
leave
where they're at
in the infra controller config. This is the majority. Those are there's only a couple. There's 3 main roles that are like that, and then there's a couple, like I said, there's 2 or 3 plugins that we also had that we did not include in the PR.
And do these roles have any kind of standard pattern that we could kind of like automate how they're built so that if we made a change to the collection, we could just like run a script and these roles would be auto-generated? Or is it going to be a manual? Someone has to go in and update these roles when the collection updates?
It would probably need to be manual because we do have quite a bit of extra logic behind, like there's other options depending on what type of option
Right
it is.
now, yeah, right now we do the export model plus what we call a simplified model. So like, let's take a job template name. Either take job template dot name. This is list items, or I don't. Sorry, name's not a great one, but basically, if you have job template dot organization, it will either take straight name being that field, or it'll take organization dot name. Because export does organization dot name. So we'll do both ways in terms of that, and we have sub items. Some of them are taken where you have extra bars have to be a certain format and things like that. Like you might be able to write automation about it. Like if you add an option, it's basically copy another item and just basically add the one line to add the option with the right variable name. Go to like not a defaults main, but a tasks main. David. So defaults I don't think show quite well, but like these are the extra options we have in here. You turn on and off. One is the enforced defaults, which we'll be moving to doing at the module level once that PR is approved. Another one's like the async delay and retries, and then secure logging can be turned on and off at a role level if you want to do it that way. But these are like global, almost global options we have attached to every role.
Okay. I'm just going to highlight some things that came in on the chat. So Chad said, wouldn't this slow down the updates as they will have to go into AWX? And then David responded with AWX releases about once a month, and currently we don't release that often. So I'd say no, not really. Do we want to talk about that at all, or do we feel good with that?
I think the slowdown is not from release. I think the slowdown would come from merging things in, not so much us cutting releases, because we cut the release. The releases are automated. So
now to that point, because you guys do really good at tagging and stuff, is it possible to expand code owner to like we can do a code owner just to the collection stuff, right? And then we could then potentially give Sean and like myself the ability to just do the collection stuff to be able to approve those PRs. That potentially could help relieve some of the extra, anything that extra, effort that would cause on the team. And then limit obviously to just the collection, because that, is where our skill set is an idea.
And then like there's the merge issues, is like everything does get slowly merged. But basically I think part of it is putting them together with the modules and putting integrated tests in with the modules. With the roles basically allows for deeper testing and allowing for your like the testing itself. If we get it running right, will basically test itself and even detect changes that might break other things.
I don't know the
Otherwise-
answer to the GitHub question. I don't know if we have like a GitHub expert on here. I know we have wanted to be able to add like approvers for certain areas, but I don't think we've done that yet.
I do know that David and I do have access to Ansible, or now as part of another thing that we've been doing. So that should make it easier.
I've never done it to directories though. Like
I
inside of
looked into code ownership in the past. I'm not 100%, but I'm fairly confident that there is a way to do it to directories. So I think that it would be a possibility for sure.
And then Chad had brought up a point about what is benefit of it in AWX. And I think part of it is that right now is I must view it as the roles and the modules themselves are the engine, and the roles are like how a user would then they're like the car itself, and you're kind of putting both of them together to make a well-oiled a well-running machine that gets things done. It's one reason. The other part of it is this is the larger push that we're trying to make, and we put up an RFE around it as well, of getting the roles certified. A lot of users, even with the validated stuff, have come back and pushed up against this of, it's not certified, so we don't want to use it.
And just because that is where I work. Do users know the difference between validated and certified?
A lot of times you'll try to explain it to them, and they'll basically, I think it's just too new of a concept for them.
Okay, because I think the other thing too is, and we're starting to bleed into territory that I don't think is appropriate for the community. But there is some change coming around that too as well. That's still new, like new as of last week. So we might want to. That might be a cause for concern, at least not to merge it immediately. So let's see.
It was more of I wanted to not, beat around the bush about it. This is the upstream, this is the AWX meeting, but we're basically seeing it from both sides, from upstream and downstream.
I guess I'll be the bad guy in the room. I'm just concerned about the support for this and how it'll change the support for the folks that have to do this, community or Red Hat, etc. This adds a lot more overhead to the engineering folks.
And I think one of the things is that, at least from David and I's perspective, we didn't expect to basically lump it onto engineering and leave them to it and stop supporting it. It was just more of like working better together sort of thing, and us continuing our work of what we've been doing and updates and stuff like that.
Yeah, I'm sure I know that our community that does help support the main three of us who maintain the collections will, continue their effort, even if it does move into here. And then that's why I was offering that we could easily, if we could just do something like the code owner and just add us to those, just the specific collection folder to then be able to approve anything that's just relating to that.
Is it just a namespace thing? So would it be okay to just move the content that you currently have in I think it's the Red Hat Insights namespace, and move that to the Ansible namespace? Is that enough? Does it have to live in AWX? Because I'm with Chad on this, and I know that you all are willing to take up I know you want to do code owners files and have permission to merge just the stuff, but I'm thinking sheerly of keeping issues clean, right? Because now we're gonna have issues for all the things, right? Not just bugs with AWX. Now this can be bugs with a collection, right? Bugs with a role.
But you already
well-
have but you basically have the same, you already have that issue where you have your collection in here that you get bugs for all the time. So the role is like, there could be a bug in the role. Realistically, there's oftentimes it's more usually a module because these are just a template built on top of the module. There's been quite a few issues that we've run into that ends up just being the module that either it's a version issue or some other thing along those lines. So yes, there would
I
be,
bring
it
up
would
the
add
actual
some.
roles
I
instead of
don't
the.
think it would be
Yeah.
significant.
Yeah, so I have in the sharing, this is the main task from the ad hoc command role. And we can see inside this role, it's really just calling ad hoc command and then passing in data or default.
Yeah,
And
it's
that's
just a
the only
structured-
task in there.
It's just a very clean, structured way of allowing users to commonly just basically pass a list of variables to call the modules. And so then it allows your configuration for your AWX to just be basically a var list and just a handful of var lists that you then can just easily maintain. That's
I would go to
basically
the
all I'm saying.
organization tasks main. The ad hoc one, I think, is even simple, even one of the most simplified ones that we have because it was just we made it a philosophy to make a wrapper on every role or every module.
I have a quick question. These are being moved from somewhere else.
Go ahead.
Is that one being deprecated, and or is there a plan for moving things back and forth from this one to that one and vice versa? Otherwise, you're going to get divergence, right?
Yeah, no, if the PR is accepted, we would remove these roles out of that one and only keep the ones that we find that are probably not as easily maintainable or that didn't seem to fit the main like objective here to stay in their current repo. So that collection repo would still exist, but it would just be a subset of what it is now.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and you can see here, I think we included the enforce default options. Is that was my first attempt at doing. There's another PR out there where we moved it to the module level, so all of that would disappear as well.
Does anybody else from the community want to chime in on this? I'm gonna put community members on the spot here just to see. Not that we're not all community, but a lot of us speaking have been from Red Hat. Okay, no worries. Are there any other questions about this that anybody has? Okay, so I will be the first to admit that I don't know what the process here is. I don't know, like, do we take a vote or is there someone ultimately who would make a decision on behalf of AWX? Are there any people who have been around longer than I have who might have that answer?
You're talking about trying to get this, like, take a vote, or if we're going to accept it or not?
Yeah.
Well, that's a great question, but I think we also need to. There needs to be a conversation about downstream as well, which isn't going to take place here.
Okay.
Yeah, I think part of this was we were just trying to just kind of give you a little bit of backstory. I think this is my third attempt at raising an issue, and the last attempt I think was a 2-year-old PR, or a 1.5-year-old PR that had gone stale. And so we thought it had basically evolved enough, and enough people had been using it, and we kind of encouraged people to basically add comments and support, just more of around trying to raise the question and to ask what would it take, is there willingness within the community, and things like that, to at least open the conversation around it. Like, we'd continue still doing our thing if it was voted down. We think that in the end, the product is better with both of them together.
I have another question. David mentioned that we're already screening issues for AWX collections, like in the AWX repo and GitHub project. Like, is that true? Is that the right place for that? Do we do a lot of AWX collections issue triage from within Ansible/AWX?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
So
then that
that's where
makes
the
sense.
collection lives.
Yeah, so the collection
collection
lives in AWX.
There's been conversation about potentially moving that out, but I think the collection testing is tied pretty heavily to the repository itself right now.
Oh, that's true. I've seen that. Okay.
Could you not just clone from like the other repository to easily keep that integration? Just out of curiosity.
I haven't looked, so I would err on Alan or whoever helped write the first stuff.
And just
Yeah.
for reference, I put in my little bookmark that I have that basically shows only issues for AWX collections, and currently it is 57 of the open 1,400 issues in the repo.
So this is something we kind of went back and forth with when we initially built the collection. We were debating between having it in its own repo and having its own release cycle versus putting it in the AWX repo and releasing it with AWX as the same thing. And we opted to go releasing them together as the same thing. So that's kind of the short history of it.
But wasn't that more around keeping the collection and the version of AWX in lockstep versus any other technical reason? So there isn't any technical reason that we need to keep even the AWX collection things inside of AWX, right?
Other than the testing that has evolved since that decision was made, I don't think there's anything that
I think it's part of its tech debt is right now the AWX are the roles that we're discussing here test against, up until a week ago, I believe it was 6 different versions of AWX whenever we do a merge. And so we do have the tooling already built around that if we wanted to transfer.
we could say the same about AWX Kit as well. I don't know why we chose to put them all into one giant repo instead of individual ones, but that can be a conversation for later.
Yeah, I was just asking. But like I said, I mean, right now, I don't think that the ask is going to add significant amount more of issues, you already are getting from the way it currently is set up.
Okay, so unless there's any other comments or questions about this particular subject, I would say let's continue discussion inside of this poll, which I think was already linked in the chat, but I think some people might have joined afterwards, so I will go ahead and link that again. And then, yeah, if there's nothing else, we can move on to the next topic for this meeting. Going once, going twice. All right, thank you all for that discussion. So moving on, Seth Foster is going to talk about job life cycles a little bit. Seth, do you want to give some background on this, or do you want me to give you a little little bit more of an intro?
I can describe it. Let me actually just pull up my presentation. I'll take over the screen share. I have a bit of a slide deck that will kind of help us navigate this, but 1 second. Yeah, so what I wanted to do was to just take some time to describe, going from the process of hitting, launch job in the UI to getting a successful status back and the events being in the database, and just sort of what that process entails. There's a lot of components in the AWX application that gets touched whenever a job is actually launched. It is a most essential part of AWX, and most of the work it goes into making sure that the job runs successfully. So we also have a concept called job lifecycle, where we sort of log out to the standard out. You probably noticed one of the prefixes of the log statement is lifecycle, and it captures various points in time as a job transitions from the start pending status all the way to the end. So let me just, that's kind of my preamble, but let me just kind of get into my slide deck here. And this is like, at any point, if you have questions about a slide, just feel free to stop me. This isn't like a formal presentation or anything, but so just if you have questions, go ahead and raise your hand, and I'll try to pay attention to the chat, or just chime in on the mic and I'll try to answer it as I go. But I really hope that this kind of helps give people a deeper understanding of how internally AWX is connected, how jobs run through the system. And yeah, so let's go ahead and get started here. So I wanted to start with basically an anatomy of AWS, just to kind of set the stage. So in this example diagram, we have an AWX that is deployed with 1 web pod and 2 task pods, and a managed Postgres that is running inside of the cluster. So as most people here know, web pods will handle the HTTP requests. This is where Nginx, USG, and Django REST framework code runs. The task pods are different, but they handle they don't handle any of the web requests. They handle running background system tasks. They dispatch AWX jobs, and they handle event processing. So as you know, a job status will go from pending to waiting to running and then to successful, or a failed state if the Ansible playbook fails. And as I mentioned before starting the slides, the key moments of a job's lifecycle are logged by the system. So for example, in the bottom right, you will see these are the log messages that I got when running the demo job in AWX. So you can see the first one there is created. We get one for waiting. We get ones for pre-running, preparing a playbook, etc. So we're going to use these as a guide as we're going through the life cycle of a job to kind of explain where in the system various things are occurring. So I'm going to keep this up, and I'm going to highlight in blue where we are in the job's life cycle as we sort of proceed through this. Okay, so here's the first step in launching a job. So it all begins when a user launches a job. An HTTP post is sent to the launch endpoint of a job template. The USG worker handles this request and will eventually call a Django view. This view will create a job entry in the database and copy over the contents such as playbook, verbosity level, and the execution environment information from the template to the job. So really, this first step is really just creating an entry in the database, and it sort of mimics the template and carries over a bunch of attributes from the job template to the job. And at this stage, we have set the job status to pending. Also, interestingly, this is the only part of the job's lifecycle that involves the web pod. Pretty much the rest of the steps are all going to involve the task pod, and specifically the task container running inside of the task pod. Okay, so at this point, we have a job that's in the pending status. So what happens next? The task manager wakes up and it looks for any jobs with a pending status. and it loops through each one of those pending jobs, and it checks a few things. The first thing it checks is to make sure that all of the dependencies for that job are resolved. That means any project updates, inventory source updates are completed and have succeeded. Also, it makes sure that the control nodes and execution nodes have enough capacity to run the job. And at this point, the task manager sets the status of the job to waiting. And at that point, you will get a waiting lifecycle log emitted to the standard out for that job. The task manager system also will submit the job to the assigned control node via the Postgres notify listener system. So let's look at what that looks like in a little bit more detail. So in this example, the task manager is running on task pod A and uses PG notify to submit a job to task pod B. PG notify, as you can see, takes an argument, which is the queue name to submit to, and it also will submit the job information. And on the right side, you can see that task pod B is listening on a queue called task pod B. So this is how our system essentially communicates from one cluster, one task pod running in the cluster to delegating tasks to another task pod. And this is the mechanism we use to sort of distribute work and signal to the other nodes on the cluster. We use the PG notify listener system. And here's a real world example of the job information that is submitted to the Postgres message bus. You don't pay too much attention to the details. Just kind of want to see, just kind of give you a context of what that message looks like. It's just a Python dictionary. It has some key elements. It has the ID of the job. And importantly, you can see an entry there called task. This is the class of that type of job. We have different classes for system jobs, project updates, inventory syncs. In this case, since we're running a demo job, the class is going to be run job. Okay, so that's the message that gets sent to the Postgres message bus and will be picked up on the other end by task pod B. So we're still in waiting phase here. This is the point where a dispatcher worker starts the job. So a dispatcher service on task pod B will turn this stream into a Python callable and execute it. So it just reads the stream, turns it into a callable. You can go into our code base and see that run job is a class in one of our files. You can read what it does, but this dispatcher process will just turn it into a callable and run it. And at this point, we're turning the job status to running and saving to the database. And we will emit this message on the right called job3 pre-run. We call it pre-run because we're not running any Ansible playbook commands yet. We're just sort of prepping up the stage to get stuff running. So what does that staging look like? So we now emit a log lifecycle called preparing playbook. And during this phase, what we do is we build up what we call the private data dirt. So we create a temporary directory that will contain all of the essential files required to run the Ansible playbook. If you shell into the task container and you go to the /temp folder, you'll see when you're running a job, the temporary directory being created for a particular job. One of the first steps that we do is we simply copy over all the project files into the project subdirectory of that temporary directory. So for example, in this case, 6 was the ID of the demo project, which has our hello world playbook that we're going to run. And all of these files just get copied over into that temporary folder. The top right shows you a tree structure of basically what the final private data dirt looks like after we've built up all the essential files. So you can see the project folder has the hello world.yaml. The inventory folder has our hosts file, which contains all our host information. We have an extra vars file, and all of this is just sitting in files in the temp directory. So now we're at the point where we're getting close to actually running the job. This is really just, these next few slides are going to talk about how we actually run the job itself. So the first thing is we're going to submit the job to Receptor. The entire private data dirt that I showed on the previous slide is zipped up in memory just as a byte stream and transmitted via a Unix domain socket connection to receptor. Receptor then uses an in-cluster authentication to create a pod to run the job. So in the diagram below, you can see this arrow here. This is just passing the standard in over the Unix domain socket. This is information, just the private data that's been zipped up, the byte stream is passed over to receptor. And receptor is then going to communicate with the Cube API, and the Cube API is going to create a pod that's going to run the job. And on the right, this whole window of time that I'm describing is sort of capturing a window of time. And in this window of time, you'll see 3 different job lifecycle messages emitted, one for running the playbook, one for the work unit ID received and assigned. The work unit ID is what comes back from receptor. So when the task container interacts with receptor and says, run this job, we get a work unit ID back. And that is how the task container is going to sort of monitor and make sure that we get all of the data back from the receptor sort of work unit. Okay. And let's look a little bit more detail about this automation job pod that gets spun up. So here is what the pod spec looks like for running that. This is just sort of the default pod spec that is used when you run the demo job. Notice that there's a container called worker, which is the container that's going to run the Ansible runner command. And you can see the image is set to AWX EE latest. So that's, if you had a different custom EE, this pod spec would point to that particular EE. And since this is the default execution environment, that's the one that is used for the demo job. Let's also look a little bit closer to how the receptor interacts with that pod that gets spun up from the Cube API. So receptor's on the left, it passes the zipped private data dir as standard into the automation job pod. And that gets Ansible runner worker will read this standard in and unzip it to a /runner directory. After it unzips it, it then runs an Ansible playbook. And I've even printed out here the exact Ansible playbook command that it's going to run after it unzips that private data dir into its own running container. And then what happens is Ansible runner starts emitting as standard out various basically job events, essentially, from the running playbook. It emits some other details too, but the core of it is that it's emitting actual standard out, the same standard out you'll see in the UI when you look at a finished job that's running. So that's what gets streamed out of the pod and back into receptor. Processing job events. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how do we go from, because right now things are running inside of a pod in the cluster, how do things get back into the task container, and eventually how do they get into Postgres? So this is what this diagram demonstrates here. The task container streams the Ansible runner job events from receptor, parses them, and then pushes them into a Redis queue. And then what happens is a callback receiver worker reads from the Redis queue and does a bit of parsing and then basically inserts them into the Postgres database via Django's bulk crate. So you can think of these arrows as job events that are flowing starting from receptor, which is streaming back data from the automation job pod. The dispatcher reads those, pushes them into a Redis queue. And that is one of the main purposes of the Redis container that's inside of the task pod. And then the callback receiver is another process that's running in parallel in the task container that is reading from that queue and simply bulk inserting it into Postgres database. So that's how the job events get eventually into Postgres. Okay, coming toward the end of a job lifecycle here. So the job is then marked as successful. So at the end of a job, Ansible runner will emit a status line to indicate whether the Ansible playbook succeeded or failed. So for example, if you run the demo job and it's successful, one of the standard out lines you get, in addition to all of the regular job events that you get, is something called stat. This is like verbatim. So it's just this little string, this line here. And then when AWX sees this, it gets passed to a status handler in code, and that status handler will turn the job status into successful. So that's essentially how we determine that the job is done and successful. And then these last three steps I've highlighted here are sort of what happens after we get the events back, after we've determined whether a job has failed or succeeded. But essentially what we do is we just do a few additional sort of tasks. The first thing we do is we save hosts fat cache to the database if the fat cache was enabled. That happens, I think, during the post run step. We also update the inventory compute fields. This is a task that runs. It can sometimes take a long time if you had like thousands of hosts. But here we tally up the hosts that have succeeded and failed for a given inventory. It's also important to note that this runs asynchronously. So this is no longer part of that original dispatcher process. This actually is running in a separate dispatcher process. And then lastly, we send any notifications that have been set up that pertain to this job and whether it succeeded or failed. So an important thing to note is that these activities that I highlight above can still be running even after the job is reported as successful in the UI. There's actually a bit of a delay. So some work can still be happening for that job, even though you see that it is successful in the UI. And that's basically it. So yeah, thank you. Does anybody have any questions regarding this? I'd be happy to answer them.
Great job, Seth. This is great. I really appreciate Seth going around and kind of advertising all these details.
Yeah, we've been doing this for a while, and there's a lot of details that I've admitted. I've glossed over quite a bit of intricate details that Alan knows about, of course. But we're trying to find ways to sort of deliver some of these sort of high level conceptual view of how a job sort of flows through the system to the community, so that developers from the community can have a better understanding of sort of this like runtime process. Also, just as developers on our team, it's good to be up to date in understanding how all of this works. I'll mention that one key thing that we're probably likely to change is this loop right here. This is the current view, but this is something that we're also trying to modify and change, just because you can see lots of errors. It's not exactly the most fluid, but there's a lot of interesting work in progress things that are going on that's going to make this loop a little bit easier and understandable and just cleaner. So really exciting stuff. But yeah, thanks for let me share all that with you.
Can I make a nitpick comment? I think on one of your almost last slides, it was talking about the things that it does as a side effect as the job status is processed at the end. The saving host fact cache was the ordering of that was changed, and that was changed from saving on individual hosts to doing a bulk update. And then by doing the bulk update, the performance wasn't as much of a concern. So that was swapped to happen before the job was reported as successful or failed. So that was kind of
oh, I see. The fat cache. The fat cache happens.
So that was a notable change. Yeah, because the feedback we got so hit by so many so many usability issues people would report that they would string things together in workflows, for instance, right? So the problem is that if you delay till after the status, then you'll introduce race conditions, whereas like it may or may not have finished doing the work by the time it allows like the next jobs in the series to start. So, you know, we do kind of have to get feedback and, you know, make decisions on those. But, you know, users, people writing clients, like they do have to know this fact that the events might still be processing when the status changes. So Yeah, I don't think the inventory computed fields really affects anybody very much. But yeah, notifications are probably a bigger point there, because you could definitely hit that same nature of race condition by notifications, because we're not offering like timing guarantees.
Yeah. Our notification system runs through Django channels, so it's often sort of asynchronous. So it's hard to make sure that the timing of those things all end up lining up. Yeah, it's been a bit of a pain, as Alan and Gabe are mentioning now. Okay, that's what I got.
Cool. Thank you so much, Seth. And unless there's any other questions, I will go on to the next topic. So the next topic is the developer series, and I just wanted to highlight this real quick. Seth actually had talked about how do we get community developers information. And so on the Ansible AWX community channel, we started a developer series. There's currently only 2 items in there, but I'm hoping that's going to keep growing. So yeah, please watch these and give me comments and tell us what else you'd like to see from a development type perspective. That's all I had for that. And then one more thing before we close out, Jake, you wanted to take a couple minutes?
Oh yeah, not even a couple minutes, just a couple, like 30 seconds. Just because we finally got something on the calendar. But if anybody is in and around the RDU area, we finally have another meetup. It's been 3.5 years of hiatus, but Sean Cavanaugh, I know some folks may know Sean, is giving a talk about one of his most popular blog posts. So if anybody's around, I'm trying to investigate streaming and seeing if I can make it like available outside of like just the room we're in. But since we're hosting it in Durham, that kind of limits my capability at the moment, just because I don't have the technology to do that yet, like microphones essentially. So hey, that's all.
Cool, thank you. I hope you all have fun on that one. So yeah, thanks to everyone who took the time to attend or watching this on YouTube later on. As a reminder, this will be posted to YouTube on our YouTube channel. So if you missed part of it or you want to rewatch Seth's excellent talk about job lifecycle, you can watch it there. And with that kind of concludes everything. We still have 7 minutes. So if there's anybody that wants to bring up anything for discussion.
I think we have something shown in chat from Seth. If someone could take a quick peek at the conversation I created regarding a good first issue, I would really appreciate it. Looks like it came from the mailing list.
Cool. Yeah, let's take a look at it. Usually just as an FYI, some of us will get together on Wednesdays and Fridays and reply. So you'll probably see an official reply to this tomorrow, but let's take a look. So I'd like to work on this issue, but I'm told a newbie with AWX. Well, thank you for joining and being willing to work on an issue. Which scenarios has higher priority? So this is this in the UI? Okay, I don't know if we have any UI developers on here that can answer this. Do we have anyone from UI who could talk to this? No. Okay, we can take a look at it and see if we can answer it, but we might have to defer to a UI person. So which scenario has higher priority? The user should be redirected in the following scenario. User logs out, clicks on receive link to that. I know Mike has done some about this, done some work around this. I feel like there was an issue when they were doing this, that if like a different user was logging in, that different user would be redirected to the last resource that the previous user was on, which could be an issue if they had different permissions. And I think that's why on logout, you're redirected to the home screen. I could be wrong on that. I don't know if anybody else has that kind of recollection. But I would say on a timeout, like from my own personal perspective, it would be really nice to go back to where you were post timeout.
I know at least for me, if I have multiple tabs open, it will be like whatever tab was last active or something weird like that.
Yeah, that'd be good. Wherever I was last, like there.
So, I mean, there's also the other, I mean, there are other scenarios here, right? What happens if somebody presents you a link and it's not a link that you have permission to, right? Should we send you to the dashboard or should we 404 it, right? I mean, there's a bunch of scenarios that you can think of on log out and log back in. But to me, these two seem, I mean, they seem reasonable, right? Like I think that the scenario should be wherever you were previously, you should go back to, and then once you log back in, then you can, I guess, click the link again.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the main thing that I would say though is if you're hitting a RBAC issue, it should 404. Right? Like if you don't have permission to see that object, it should 404. Or it's going to be really confusing to the user why they can't see it.
Yeah, I feel like there was something about, like, some people may consider that like a security thing. Because if you see, like, say it was like a named URL or something, you could potentially get exposed to some information in the URL. I don't personally see it as a big deal, but who knows?
Yeah, I remember that coming up.
I mean, I could see the argument in some case, but like on the other side, like if you see that, like if you're given that URL anyways and you don't have permission to it, it's still already showing you the object exists, right? So I don't see that that's big of a, like there's not much.
Well, I think people do 404 instead of 403 for that reason, right? Like normally it's 403 for permission. And like 404, you don't know, is it there and I can't see it, or is it there, or is it not there? Like, is it missing? That's the security thing, I think.
I will also mention that there is like a new UI being built. So I just want to kind of throw that out there. I don't know if the new UI behaves differently. I will definitely see if we can reach out to the UI team and get someone from UI to respond to this for you. It looks like there was another request that came up, and I think Seth might have addressed that. Are we all set there?
Yeah, I think so. And we'll take a look at this one in tomorrow's meeting a little bit more. But at least the workflows are running so we can see if they pass or fail. But it looks like it's shaping up, so we'll try to get this merged in, or at least take a look at it tomorrow.
All right, then if nobody else has anything, we are at the top of the hour, and thank you once again for everyone who attended. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.